Hello everyone, my name is Irina Surdu and I'll present this paper on behalf of my colleagues Julio and Steve, and the title of the paper is What Happens Abroad Stays Abroad, Reputation Risks of MNE Irresponsibility in Home and Host Markets. Now, the key focus of the paper and the question in this paper is how does public disclosure of corporate social irresponsibility influence MNE reputation? Now, the rationale of this research is that multinational enterprises are increasingly accused of behaving irresponsibly, and this happens in their home markets, but of course in host markets as well. And of course, it is assumed that public disclosure of this social irresponsibility can be damaging to the firm's performance, often through the mechanism of the firm's reputation. And reputation is considered a key firm-specific advantage that will enhance performance, help firms overcome some of the limitations associated with liability of foreigners when going into international markets and so on. And by looking at a behavioral perspective, particularly focusing on egocentric biases, we actually examine the extent to which these CSI disclosures can erode an MNE's reputation. And these CSI disclosures may take place in the home market of the firm or different host markets in which the firm operates. And we're looking at this over time in order to be able to actually measure changes in an MNE's reputation year on year. We have a sample of over 2,000 CSI events associated with Fortune 500 firms, and we focus specifically on US-based MNEs, which represent the largest proportion of these Fortune 500 firms. And our study, as I will explain later, confirms the strong influence of CSI location and CSI type on changes in MNE reputation. So in other words, the disclosure of corporate social irresponsibility will influence an MNE's reputation based on where this social irresponsibility is associated have happened, i.e. in the firm's home market versus different host markets. So there is going back to this point, there is a location boundedness of reputation and of social evaluations of the firm, which we want to shed light on. As a background story, of course, we know that M&E theory has been dominated by this perspective. A firm-specific advantage, such as a firm's reputation, are associated with higher performance and a greater chance of performing not only in the domestic market, but also internationally. And of course, as a result of that, firms are concerned with protecting these assets. When these assets are damaged or when these assets are weakened, such as a firm's reputation in the market, MNEs are expected to react by reducing their commitment to the market in order to reduce that damage to their reputations. Based on these assumptions, of course, we formulate a series of hypotheses. To start with, we argue that egocentrism and egocentric biases, which we define as the unconscious tendencies of individuals to emphasize information important to themselves and their in-group members and de-emphasize the importance of information regarding others and out-group members. So we argue that when making decisions about assessing the reputation of a firm, individuals suffer from these biases. And this in turn will have an impact on how firm reputation is assessed by stakeholders, particularly key stakeholders such as industry analysts and investors, which are the stakeholders of focus in our paper. Now, because instances of CSI can be perceived to pose a threat to the safety of the individual or the individual's in-group members, CSI that arises within the home market location is more likely to trigger these egocentric biases. It's more likely to stimulate stakeholders to strongly react to acts of irresponsibility. And of course, in turn, it will influence M&E reputation. And this is because egocentric biases are key to making decisions, and also they perform an important cognitive function because they help us prioritize information that may prove threatening to self-preservation. And this is a well-established literature on the importance of egocentric biases. Now, our first hypothesis assumes that a negative relationship will exist between public disclosure of corporate social responsibility and M&E reputation. And this negative effect is stronger when CSI arises in the home country. And again, the rationale behind it is that egocentric biases and an individual's underlying tendency to prefer and emphasize and considers more important the information regarding themselves and their in-group may manifest a bias of empathy towards stakeholders harmed by CSI in the home market, but also in international locations with substantial similarities to that home market. So egocentric biases may extend beyond the nuclear group, which is in this case the US market, towards an extended group, which is in this case, as we refer to, the Western host country market. So a second hypothesis assumes that the negative relationship between public disclosure of corporate social irresponsibility and MNE reputation is stronger in Western host markets and weaker in non-Western host markets. So again, the rationale here is that location of corporate social irresponsibility matters. Now, if you have a quick look at our theoretical framework, starting from the left-hand side, we symbolize this idea of distance, which is focal CSI event closer to home will have a stronger impact as a result of egocentric biases than events that happen far away. Now, as these events unfold, they're perceived by reputational assessors, different groups of stakeholders, and through egocentric biases, these assessors make a decision about a firm's reputation. And again, this will depend on the location of CSI, whether it's associated with the nuclear group, which is the home market, extended in-group, which is a Western host market, or an out-group threat associated with a non-Western host market location. And this type of decision will influence, of course, reputation erosion. And MNE reputations change as a result of the perceived severity of the CSI event as a function of its location. In terms of our methods and data use, we built a bespoke data set. Our reputation change measure uses Fortune magazine's World Most Admired Companies survey, and we compute the dependent variable as a year-on-year change in reputation score starting with 2005. Corporate social irresponsibility is the data obtained from Asset4 dataset, which has been validated and cross-referenced against media reports through Flactiva and LexisNexis. CSI location was obtained by manually analyzing the content of these media reports and determining the location of the CSI event disclosed. And of course, we use a series of control variables as per previous papers to account for the size, return on asset, and so on associated with financial measures for the firms involved. Now we have a series of key results that I'm going to go through. So when looking at CSI in general as a summary of all the events that have happened and associated with the firm in the previous year, we find that actually when it comes to the MNE's home market, so if you look in model 2, the effect of CSI broadly on associated with the US market, we see a negative effect, also a negative but weaker effect as hypothesized when it comes to host Western markets. But when we look at the relationship between CSI and changes in reputation for non-Western markets, this effect is also negative, but it's insignificant. So again, we already see some differences in the manner in which reputation is affected depending on where specifically CSI has been associated with. Also interesting is that we decided to look at different types of CSI events. Some of them, what we refer to stakeholder-specific CSI, those that may influence investors and industry analysts in particular, like competitive CSI, management compensation, financial CSI, taxation, and others non-stakeholder specific, consumer, employee-related, environmental CSI, ethics, human rights, and public health. Naturally, the assumption would be that stakeholder-specific CSI has a stronger effect than non-stakeholder specific CSI, together with location effects. However, we find a mix of findings here, some quite interesting. So if we start with the right-hand side, we can see that when it comes to events such as consumer, employee, human rights, and so on, in many instances, we even see a positive effect of some of these acts of irresponsibility when associated with the host non-Western markets. At the very best, we see a non-significant effects associated with these acts of irresponsibility. As hypothesized, many of them have a negative effect associated with the home US market, and this effect decreases but remains significant when it comes to the host Western market. So largely for the events that we do find to have an effect on reputation, they tend to be stronger when it comes to the firm's nuclear in-group. Interestingly, financial CSI, which I have highlighted here, tends to be the one event that is non-location bound. So we can see when it comes to financial CSI here, it has a negative effect associated with the home, negative effects slightly stronger associated with the host, and negative effect associated with non-Western markets, and still somewhat significant. So financial CSI tends to be the only CSI type that is non-location bound. Although again, there's a reduction in significance when it comes to events associated with non-Western markets. Egocentric perceptions also appear strongest for events such as environmental CSI, consumer CSI, human rights CSI types, which again, it's something that's worth exploring in future research as well, which shows that the importance of looking at different types of events that may matter for different types of stakeholders. And of course, one of the reasons why CSI such as consumer CSI may be associated with negative effects, such strong negative effects, is because consumer CSI could be expected to lead to a reduction in sales, a reduction in market growth, which can have an impact on financial performance, which is something these investors and our key stakeholders care about. So sometimes expectations of how other types of stakeholders will react matter parallel to egocentric biases. Overall, our results confirm that for MNEs, corporate behavior is only socially irresponsible to the extent that it is perceived as such. And this research contributes to research that has already been done in broad management literature that hypothesizes about this type of behavior and perceptions when it comes to social evaluations of the firms like reputation. But these studies have not looked at multinational enterprises in the past. Our contributions. Theoretically, we contribute to the IB literature by adding a behavioral lens to our understanding of how stakeholders perceive M&E behaviors, depending on the location of these behaviors, in this case, social irresponsibility behaviors. We also argue that reputation-based firm-specific advantages are not always firm-specific, cannot always be controlled, and they're not always advantageous for the M&E. We respond to calls for international business to actually look at the grand challenges. Some of them are related to the relationship between business and society and the social responsibilities of these multinational enterprises. And of course, broadly, we propose that as managers become concerned with perception management challenges, it is pertinent for them to understand the nature of reputation-based FSA erosion, and going back to the idea that we cannot always control these types of intangible resources. Thank you very much for listening, and please feel free to contact me if you have further questions on our research.